There's a moment that arrives quietly. You stop mid-sentence, realizing you've been explaining yourself for the last 10 minutes, and the person across from you still doesn't get it. Not because they're not listening, not because you're not clear, but because something inside you has shifted so deeply that the language you used to speak no longer translates. And here's the part that surprises you. You don't feel the need to make them understand anymore. Not out of bitterness, not out of superiority, but because you've reached a psychological stage where your sense of self no longer depends on being seen correctly by anyone else. Carl Jung spent decades studying what he called individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you truly are, and he observed that most people never complete it. But those who do, they enter what Jung described as a state of psychological wholeness, a stage where external validation becomes irrelevant, not because you've shut people out, but because you've finally arrived at yourself. This isn't about isolation. It's about sovereignty. Stay with me for the next 12 minutes, because if you've ever felt the strange freedom of no longer needing anyone to get you, this will explain what's actually happening inside your psyche. Let's start with where most of us begin. For the majority of human life, we operate in what Jung called the persona, the mask we construct to navigate social expectations. And embedded within that mask is an invisible script. If they understand me, I exist. You explain yourself to your family so they'll accept you. You explain yourself to your friends so they'll validate your choices. You explain yourself to your partner so they'll love the real you. And when they don't understand, you try again, harder, with more words, more evidence, more vulnerability. But here's what most people don't realize. The need to be understood is a form of psychological dependency. Research on external validation suggests that when your self-concept relies heavily on others affirming your identity, you remain tethered to their perceptions, unable to move freely through your own psychological development. You're sitting at a coffee shop with someone you've known for years. You're telling them about a shift you've made, a boundary you've set, a belief you've released, and they look at you with concern. You're different, they say. Are you okay? And in that moment you realize they're not asking if you're okay. They're asking if you're still the version of you that made sense to them. Jung understood this. He wrote extensively about how individuation, the process of integrating the unconscious and becoming whole, often distances you from people who knew the old you. Not because you've become cold, but because you've stopped performing. Here's the uncomfortable part. Because this shift doesn't arrive without cost. There were moments when you needed to be understood, desperately. You sent the long text, you had the 3-hour conversation. You laid it all out, line by line, hoping that if you could just explain it clearly enough, they'd finally see you. And they didn't. And the disappointment landed in your chest like a stone. But then something else happened. You stopped trying. Not out of defeat, not because you stopped caring, but because you realized their understanding of you was never the point. The real shift wasn't external, it was internal. You stopped waiting for someone else to reflect you back to yourself. You stopped needing permission to be the person you'd already become. And admitting that can feel like betrayal, like you're abandoning the relationships that once held you. Jung described this as confronting the shadow, the parts of ourselves we'd rather not see, and one of the deepest shadows in the individuation process is this. You will outgrow the need to be known by people who refuse to know themselves. That sounds harsh, but it's not cruelty. It's self-preservation. You wake up one morning and realize your body doesn't tighten anymore when someone misunderstands you. You don't feel compelled to correct the record. You don't feel the urge to defend, explain, or justify. You just let it be. And that stillness, that's not apathy. That's freedom. So what is this stage, psychologically speaking? In Jungian psychology, the ultimate goal of individuation is the realization of what Jung called the self, the archetype of wholeness. This isn't the ego is the conscious I, the part of you that navigates daily life, makes decisions, and interacts with the world. The self is something larger. It's the integration of your conscious and unconscious, your light and shadow, your persona and your depth. And here's the key. When you reach the self, you stop looking outside for confirmation of who you are. Not because you're arrogant, but because you've done the internal work to know yourself so thoroughly that other people's interpretations no longer destabilize you. Jung often spoke about the second half of life, a psychological phase that typically begins in midlife, where the focus shifts from building an external identity, career, family status, to cultivating an internal one, meaning, purpose, wholeness. And one of the clearest markers of this shift, you stop explaining yourself. You stop defending your choices. You stop justifying your boundaries. You stop hoping someone will finally get it. Because the person who needs to understand you already does. It's you. Let's not romanticize this, because this stage has its own distortions. The first shadow is spiritual bypassing disguised as sovereignty. You tell yourself you don't need to be understood, but really, you're just avoiding intimacy. You've confused self-sufficiency with emotional unavailability. If you find yourself saying, "No one gets me and I'm fine with that," but you're also deeply lonely, that's this shadow. The second is using your evolution as a weapon. You dismiss people who still need validation as unawakened or stuck. You forget that you, too, once needed to be seen. You forget that individuation isn't a badge of superiority, it's a lifelong process of humility. The third is mistaking detachment for enlightenment. You stop engaging because you've decided engagement is beneath you. You refuse to explain not because you've integrated the self, but because you've calcified into isolation. You've mistaken withdrawal for wholeness. The fourth is expecting others to match your pace. You've done years of shadow work, therapy, and self-reflection, and now you look at people who haven't and you judge them. You forget that everyone's individuation timeline is different. You forget that growth isn't a race. Jung was clear, individuation doesn't make you superior, it makes you more human. If your freedom from needing to be understood has made you less compassionate, less connected, less capable of love, you haven't reached the self. You've just built a more sophisticated defense mechanism. So how do you honor this freedom without becoming unreachable? First, allow others to not understand you without making them wrong. Their confusion isn't rejection, it's just a different vantage point. You can hold your truth and let them hold theirs. No need for agreement, no need for alignment, just coexistence. Second, speak when it matters, stay silent when it doesn't. Not every misunderstanding requires correction. Not every misperception needs to be challenged. Save your energy for the conversations that hold weight. Let the rest fall away. Third, grieve the version of connection that required constant explanation. Some relationships only worked because you were endlessly translating yourself. That exhaustion was real. Honor it, and let those dynamics die without guilt. Fourth, find people who have done their own work. Jung talked about the importance of what he called psychological kinship, relationships with people who have also walked through the fire of individuation. They won't need you to explain, they'll just recognize you. Fifth, remember that sovereignty isn't about being alone, it's about being whole enough to connect without losing yourself. You can be deeply present with people without needing them to mirror you. You can love without needing to be understood. That's the paradox of the self. Here's the paradox Jung understood deeply. The less you need to be understood, the more deeply you can be known. Because when you stop performing for external validation, you stop editing yourself for approval. You stop curating. You stop moderating. You stop translating your experience into language that feels safe for others to digest. And what's left is just you. Raw, undefended, whole. And the people who are meant to see you, they will. Not because you explained yourself perfectly, but because you stopped hiding. Jung once wrote that individuation is not about perfection, it's about completeness. You don't become flawless, you become real. And real doesn't need to be understood. Real just is. If you've reached the point where you no longer feel the compulsion to make people see you correctly, know this. You're not cold, you're not disconnected, you're not failing at relationships. You've just stopped outsourcing your sense of self. And that's not a loss. That's liberation. There's a line often attributed to Jung. I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become. And maybe the truest mark of psychological maturity is this. You stop needing anyone else to witness your becoming. You stop needing them to validate it. You stop needing them to affirm it. You stop needing them to understand it. Not because you don't love them, but because you've finally learned to hold yourself. And that doesn't make you unreachable. It makes you sovereign. Because on the other side of needing to be understood, there's a version of connection that doesn't require constant translation. A version of love that doesn't demand your performance. A version of belonging that starts and ends with you. And that's not loneliness. That's wholeness.